Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thanks a lot, Tim, for helping do this again. This is maybe the 7th or 8th video we've made together now. I'm really enjoyed doing it. And this is about Tolkien and Welsh, and specifically the way what Tolkien believed and what he thought, and he was a very educated man, really crosses over a lot. There's a lot of crossover with the Britain's Hidden History project. I think Tolkien would definitely have been a fan of the project had he lived to see it. So a lot of this is going to be quotes directly from Tolkien himself, rather than saying what other people said about him. Let's look at what he actually said himself. And this seems like a reasonable place to start. I should have said that Welsh has always attracted me by its style and form more than any other, even though I first only saw it on coal trucks. I always wanted to know what it was about. So Tolkien actually grew up in first sort of 8 or 9 years of his life in South Africa, moved to England near Birmingham, and suddenly was confronted with this language, Welsh, that he'd never seen before. And I would argue, and other people have argued, that it was his fascination with Welsh when he first came across it on coal trucks, etc., that kind of sparked his interest in language. And, you know, we're all beneficiaries of that kind of interest, because if I can make this work, what was said was he'd go to the West Country, etc., for his holidays, and he'd just see all this stuff that was there that no one could explain. The image on the left is a photo actually I took on the Wye Valley. I took it because it looked, the image looked so Tolkien-esque to me, but what I realize now is this doesn't look like Tolkien. Tolkien looks like this. He took these, the ways things were built, the way things looked, as his inspiration for Middle Earth. And on the right there is one of the hill forts near Birmingham that he's thought to have explored as a child. So he suddenly came across all this history in the, if you like, in the landscape of England, but no one could speak to it. No one really knew or could speak to what was going on there. So Tolkien's childhood experiences were to come to England, come across this language and come across this culture in the landscape that no one seemed to really speak to. And I think it's well known that the first sort of bestseller he wrote was called The Hobbit, and he started that as really as an entertainment for his kids. The story of The Hobbit's well known. After The Hobbit was published, the publishers were like, that was great, do you want to send us something else? And he sent them the Silmarillion, which is a very, very, very strange book. It's almost like the book of Genesis for his world. And long before he'd written the story of The Hobbit, he'd been very interested in these sort of creation myths. And really, the Silmarillion is bigger than the Old Testament. It goes into the cosmology of Middle Earth in incredible detail. And the publishers said, oh, that's really fascinating, but no, we're not going to publish that because it's far too weird, far too obscure. No, thank you. But Tolkien spent the rest of his life trying to develop this Silmarillion, because it's called cosmology. He was thinking in really big terms. It was more for him than just dragons and dwarves and gold. He was talking about almost a creation myth. And for me, you know, a lot of people have pointed out that his sort of drawing, his inspiration for that would have been, on the left is an image depicting some of Paradise Lost by Milton, and on the right is an image from William Blake, I think from Jerusalem. These English poets who tried to put heaven and hell into their work, tried to encompass all of the universe, if you like. He was very much drawing on that poetic tradition. Top left on influences is a picture by William Blake. We've got a good angel and an evil angel battling out for the soul of the world. Tolkien's Christianity was massive to him. He did see things in terms of good and evil. Another influence, obviously, was the Arthurian canon. This is an image of Arthur with the sword and the stone, and Merlin stood behind him. The Arthurian legend spread across Europe was another set of themes he drew upon for, like, Aragorn, the once and returning king. The Return of the King was the name of, you know, the third part of the trilogy, and that's drawing directly on the Arthurian themes. the map of the world there's a bit of a crude representation, but Tolkien did speak a lot about the West versus the East. Again, he was just drawing on broad cultural themes from hundreds of years. It was something very much he drew upon and made part of his imaginative landscape. And that last image is from a performance of the Ring Cycle by Wagner. Wagner was massively influential and drew on centuries, millennia of German culture to create the Ring Cycle. This notion of rings of power was very much in the imaginative landscape, and this is another thing that influenced Tolkien. Speaking of influences, it's kind of much more straightforward. He is cited by George Lucas as an influence on Star Wars, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, and all those kind of fantasy TV shows. And then just more generally, elves, goblins, dwarves, orcs all became part of the imaginative furniture, if you like, of Western culture, and ended up with things like Dungeons and Dragons, you could say, which was a fantastic influence on me. And I've got to say, for me, there isn't a bigger influence on my childhood imagination than Tolkien. And I think it's a big ask to say that there was anyone who was more influential on Western culture in the 20th century. If you can think of anyone, I'd be interested, because obviously Tolkien's influence has been enormous. So what we're going to look at now is the text of a speech he gave right after the publication of The Return of the King. Right at the height of his fame, he was invited to give a lecture on what they called Celtic culture. You'll see that, like many in the Britain's Hidden History community, Tolkien also had problems with the word Celtic, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But this is the beginning of his speech. He apologizes for his dilatory performance, that he's been late. And if he says what he says, I've been busy for the last couple of years because of a large work. He's referring to Lord of the Rings as a large work, if it can be called that, which contains, in the way of presentation that I find most natural, much of what I've personally received from the study of things Celtic. In other words, the Lord of the Rings is a product and his way of expressing and sharing what he's learnt about all things Celtic. He's there to arouse or strengthen the interest of the English in various departments of Celtic studies, and describes this as a missionary enterprise. He's on a mission. And he says, in a missionary enterprise, a converted heathen may be a good exhibit. And as such, I suppose I was asked to appear. He's a convert to this mission to study Celtic culture, and he wants to share that as widely as he can. He's going to speak most particularly about the attraction of the Welsh language in itself, something that he was first made aware of by a philologist called Joseph Wright, who seemed to have played quite a mentoring role in his life. And he was also told that a little Welsh is a dangerous thing. Now, yeah. So first of all, he says, a little Welsh is dangerous yet desirable. I would say to the English philologists that those who have no first-hand acquaintance with Welsh and its philology lack an experience necessary to their business. In other words, if you want to understand English, you've got to understand Welsh. I know many scholars here and elsewhere whose official field is in English or Germanic, but who have drunk more deeply than I from this particular well of knowledge. But they often remain, as it were, secret drinkers. So there are all these linguists around who have studied Welsh, but for whatever reason, they've kind of kept it on the down low. They were secret drinkers from this well of knowledge, which I think is a lovely, very poetic way of putting it. And then he says, I grant that I am myself a Saxon, and therefore my tongue is not long enough to compass the language of heaven. Another beautiful piece of phraseology expressing his respect for the language and the culture, and saying that, you know, as an outsider, he's just doing his best to explain and experience this, which wasn't part of his, you know, birth culture. He speaks then of the way Henry VIII tried to suppress Welsh, and says, but Welsh still survives on earth, and so possibly elsewhere also. And he said this survival was despite the fact there was a contemporary effort of the English government to destroy Welsh on earth as well as in heaven. Very interestingly, he then talks in some detail about the Salisbury Welsh English Dictionary, which was not to help English people learn Welsh, but was to help to force Welsh people to learn English. And he says, it was the royal will that English language should ultimately drive out the Welsh from Wales. All ancient Welsh laws and customs at variance with English law should be held void in courts of justice, and that all legal proceedings must be conducted in English. This last and most oppressive rule was maintained until recent times, which for him means 1830. Now, this is again him speaking to a big theme in the Britain hidden history community, that of the deliberate suppression of the original culture on this island. He also mentions the in the creation of these dictionaries and the New Testament in Welsh translation, the printers in English did not have enough C's, didn't have enough letter K's, and it was thus the English printers who were really responsible for spelling Cymru with a K, but as it should be spelled, but not spelling it that way, but with a C. The last and most important and interesting thing he says here is, it is curious that this legal oppression of the Welsh language should have occurred under the Tudors, who were proud of their Welsh ancestry, and in times when the authority and favour of the politically powerful were given to what we might call the brute and all that, and that Arthurian history was official. It was hardly safe to express its in public doubt of its veracity. He also mentions that Henry VII's eldest son was called Arthur, drawing very much on this idea of the Welsh ancestry and lineage that they had. Now, this phrase, the brute and all that, needs some clarification if you're not familiar with it. The brute refers to what are called the Brute Chronicles, which were a whole sort of industry of histories of England that all said the same thing, and they've been saying the same thing for hundreds, if not longer, for hundreds of years, if not longer. The brute and all that really boils down to an origin story of the English, and if you're not familiar with it, I will just share this with you now. After the siege of Troy, a prince called Aeneas fled to Rome. This is what the Romans said about themselves. The poet Virgil was commissioned by the Emperor Augustus to write the Aeneid, which was an epic poem explaining the origins of the Roman people as Trojan. So that's what the Romans believed about themselves. Also, Aeneas is, some people say his son, but certainly a relative of Aeneas is called Brutus, went further. The legendary story that's held in the Brute Chronicles and all of this sort of thing is that actually some of the refugees from Troy eventually made it all the way to England, and possibly Brutus landed first at Totnes, but Brutus was the person who gave his name to the island Britain. And this is the brute and all that. The brute and all that Tolkien referred to is this very, 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 very widely dispersed history chronology that began with Brutus landing in southern Britain, and that was the beginning of British history, according to this school of thought. So the brute and all that the Tudors relied on was this story that their ancestors ultimately came from Troy and settled Britain. And that as Brutus's descendants, they had the right to rule. Now, throughout this speech, Tolkien makes an interesting distinction between language and race. And he says it here: language is the prime differentiator of peoples, not of races, whatever that much misused word might mean in the long blended history of Western Europe. Given they've just come out of the Second World War, the concept of race had obviously been massively abused and exploited, and Tolkien was making the point that languages are the chief distinguishing marks of people, not race, which is at best a nebulous concept. So of people, not races, we are dealing with events that are primarily a struggle between languages. And he points out that many English surnames, ranging from the rarest to the most familiar, are actually linguistically derived from Welsh. He talks more about names here. I'll just leave that up for a second if you want to read it and pause it. And then he makes it personal. I'm not German, though my surname is German. And my other names are Hebrew, Norse, Greek, and French. So he's making the point that even though he has these very exotic names, it doesn't mean anything in terms of his personal upbringing. He just happens to have a Norse name, a Hebrew name, a Greek name, and a French name. So it's a kind of a cautionary note about studying names too narrowly. And he makes this distinction several times. There was this kind of false dichotomy, I'm going to say, between Celtic culture and writing and Teutonic culture and writing, and he really brings attention to this. In that case, they are and were not either Celtics or Teutons, according to the modern myth that still holds such attraction for many minds. In this legend, Celts and Teutons are primeval and immutable creatures like a Triceratops and the Stegosaurus, two completely different beasts. Now, according to such a view, Beowulf, though in English, must, I should say, be far more Celtic, being full of dark and twilight and laden with sorrow and regret. Now, this is talking to the kind of stereotype, I'm going to say, that Celtic literature, Celtic art was very dark and dismal and doom-laden, and Saxon or Teutonic art was much more bright and colourful and kind of kinetic. So what he's pointing out there is that actually Beowulf is pretty dark and dingy, and as such, it would fit into the Celtic stereotype as set up. Beowulf obviously is one of the founding texts in English, but actually he's saying, according to this prejudice that Celtic work is dark and Teutonic work is bright, Beowulf should be called a Celtic piece of work. He's being ironic. He's pointing out the deficiencies, let's say, in the stereotypes that existed. So I've got on the left here is a depiction of Beowulf, kind of dark and dismal. This is just straight out of the film. And on the right there is a depiction of Rhiannon from the Mabinogi, who had a golden saddle and a red cloak, and was actually described in very colourful terms. So again, this stereotype of Celtic stuff being dark and dismal and Teutonic stuff being more light and vibrant is undermined by these two depictions. And Tolkien takes another quote from the Mabinogi that you can read here, and he says, a very practical man with a keen feeling for bright colour was this Poole, or the writer who described him. So this Celtic writer was very practical and had a feeling for bright colour, which are stereotypically meant to be Teutonic traits. Can he have been a Celt? He had never heard of the word, we may feel sure, but he spoke and wrote with skill what we now classify as a Celtic language, Cymraeg, which we call Welsh. So this very bright, vibrant depiction was Celtic, even though the stereotype is that Celtic depictions were very sort of dark and dismal. Now, he says right at the bottom here, I am concerned in any case only with P-Celts, and among those with the speech ancestors of the Welsh. He's not interested in Irish so much. This notion of Celtic he's going to go into in a bit more detail. But this P-Celtic, Welsh, Brittonic language and culture, it was something that covered the whole of Britain south of the Fourth Clyde Line by the 1st century AD. And this whole area shared a British or Brittonic civilization, which so far as language goes, formed a single linguistic province from Dumbarton and Edinburgh in the north to Cornwall and Kent in the south. In other words, he's asserting that the British culture, the Welsh culture, dominated this island from top to bottom. Now, there are many architectural, archaeological remnants of this culture, but Tolkien is a linguist and he's going to speak to the language and those aspects of the language. Through them, we may catch a glimpse or echo of the past, which archaeology alone cannot supply. The past of the land which we call our home. So I'm going to just take on it. You want a quick diversion here. The past of the land which we call our home. Tolkien and his friends were very much of the opinion, correctly, that after the Norman conquest and the death of Harold, who we see here being enthroned, something devastating happened to British culture. Unlike, say, the Germans, who have got hundreds and hundreds of years old stories that go all the way back into mythology, the Scandinavians, many other European countries have these ancient stories. All of these stories, I'm going to say, disappeared or were suppressed in the aftermath of the Norman conquest. Tolkien and his friends were vehemently anti-Norman. What the Normans did to British culture, they were completely against. There's some people saying, you know, that Tolkien would, compare what the Nazis did in the Second World War with their bombing to what the Normans did, and he said what the Normans did was immeasurably worse to British culture. So this is the past of the land, our land, that has somehow been taken from us. And I think it's well known that Lord of the Rings was created by Tolkien as an English epic to try and restore to us this sort of lost culture of these epic stories of good versus evil. And, you know, this was his aim, as he expressed it himself. He was trying to bring back this epic pre-Norman kind of literature to the English culture. And I just wanted to emphasize this again before I show you what comes next. Tolkien is advocating language as a way to understand the past of the land we call our home. Now, I preface this with this direct quote because it is amazing what he says next. I want to point out he was a professor of linguistics. He dedicated his life to this stuff. And what he says chimes so neatly with the Britain's Hidden History project. I thought it's very much worth sharing and building up to. Check this out. Oh, hang on. Check this out. So he's comparing now, he's talking about P-Celtic, Welsh and Latin. The distance between the two languages is greater, of course, than separating even the most divergent forms of Germanic speech. But the language of southern Britain would appear to have been one of whose sounds and words were capable of representation more Romano in Latin letters, less unsatisfactory than those of other languages with which the Romans came into contact. So Italy and Britain are a long way apart, and their languages were much, much more similar than Italian or Latin with any of the languages in France or Germany or Spain or, you know, Greece or anything. For whatever reason, the Romans found in this distant island people who spoke a language very similar to their own. We'll talk about that more in a minute. It had also, the language had entered Britain, and this seems an important point to him, in an archaic state, in a very well-developed state. The language of British came to Britain when it was already in a very mature state as a language. Some languages, I think, you know, when they're young, they morph, they change. But it seems, from Tolkien's understanding, that British, when the language arrived to Britain, was already in a very developed state, and what he calls an archaic state. Now, he says it again, British forms of language had entered Britain in an archaic state. It had long ago become, as it were, acclimatized and naturalized in Britain, so it belonged to the land in a way that English could not compete. We'll see, he talks about this more in a bit. Also, the Latin reflected by Welsh loanwords is one that remains far closer to classical Latin than that spoken Latin of the continent. I know, for example, in the Dark Ages, it was said that the Welsh monks could write and speak better Latin than a lot of the people in Rome, whose language had been corrupted by all the Germanic invasions. It seems that for a long time, possibly the place to see and hear and read classical high-end Latin was Wales. And this you can find corroborated in from lots of different sources. Again, this is all just Tolkien's take on this, and given his qualifications, I think you have to be a brave person to try and argue with what he was saying. Now, he says it again, Latin and British appear to have been similar to one another in their phonetic and morphological structure, i.e. their sounds and the shapes of the letters, to a degree unusual between languages sufficiently far separated in history to belong to two different branches of Western Indo-European language. So they're so similar. Can they really be from two different branches? They're very similar in lots and lots of ways, but they're meant to be completely different. He doesn't seem to think that that's plausible. So what is he saying? Having mentioned the brute and all that in passing with, you know, in relation to the Tudors, I'm coming back to this because everyone in his audience was a linguist. There were no, people dressed up as elves or Tolkien enthusiasts at this speech. It was a speech for linguists by a linguist, and everyone in the room would have known exactly what he was talking about. He was referring to the fact that Latin and British were like cousins. And how do you explain that? Well, certainly for some of the Britons and for some of the Romans, the answer was already there, and it was in their history. It related to the destruction of Troy and the dispersal of the refugees from Troy that eventually led to Brutus coming to Britain. You can see by intimating that there's a strong similarity between Latin and British, Tolkien was by implication referring to the brute and all that, which was a very controversial thing to have done, and he did it subtly to keep himself out of trouble. Now, let's move on. More now talking about Older English and moving it on. He gives the example of Welstud, which was an Anglo-Saxon word for interpreter, and it meant a man who could understand the language of the Welsh, the word that most commonly applied to the British. So Welstud is a bit like understood. If you understood Welsh, you were Welstud, you were an interpreter. He carries on with this, describing the development of British and Welsh and English next to each other. At one point, Britain was made the language of the devils. There was this vilification and the denigration of the British language and culture that happened over time. Mentions some stuff out of King Lear and speaks more about the association with the English and the Britons. Again, more detail about English and the Britons, especially Old English and how it fed into Britain. Old English and as it fed from Welsh into modern English. And he ends up with a summation of the term Celtic that I think most people in Britain's hidden history would have a lot of sympathy for. Celtic of any sorts, nonetheless, is a magic bag into which anything may be put and out of which almost anything may come. Anything is possible in the fabulous Celtic twilight, which is not so much a twilight of the gods as of reason. He's just saying that a lot of people have used the Celtic term to say what they want. It's almost a meaningless term. You can pull anything out of this magic bag and call it Celtic. This is very much based on his knowledge that this term really didn't ascribe to anything. As he said earlier, the writer of the Mabinogion would not have referred to himself or herself as Celtic. It's very much a term that he clearly has problems with, and I think we can all agree he was right about that, because it's too vague a term and used for too often for nefarious purposes. Now, he gives a specific instance of how the modern verb be has come into English. Now, this system is peculiar to Old English. It is not found in any other Germanic language, not even in those most closely related to English. The association with be forms of two different functions that they have no necessary logical connection is also notable. But I mention this feature of Old English morphology here because the same distinction of functions is associated with similar phonetic forms in Welsh. In other words, he's saying Old English is derived from Welsh. He's referring back to his point. If you're an English philologist, if you're studying English and you don't know about Welsh, you don't know your job. And he's giving this specific instance here, I guess contrasting it with the more nebulous notions of Celtic. He's a concrete example of how Welsh impacted English. And so he goes on, comparing and contrasting different bits of different languages with English, and he ends up with, he sums it up like this. For myself, I would say that more than the interest and uses of the study of Welsh as an adminicle of English philology, more than the practical linguist's desire to acquire knowledge of the Welsh for the enlargement of experience, more even than the interest and worth of the literature, older and newer, that is preserved in it, these two things seem important. Welsh is of this soil, this island, the senior language of the men of Britain, and Welsh is beautiful. Now, he talks quite a bit about this notion of beautiful, but I just wanted to point out this word or this phrase, Welsh as an adminicle of English philology. Now, an adminicle is a word I looked up, and so I'll share. In law, if you have a letter that says something like, "Dear Sir, in response to your letter of the 14th of July," or whatever, I'm writing back to you, that letter is an adminicle. It proves the existence of another letter. Or, you know, if I was writing to you about a will or something, this letter, the evidence of this letter is an adminicle. It gives proof or indicates that there was other things existed. So Welsh as an adminicle of English means learning about Welsh enables you to kind of show your understanding of English. It's a prerequisite, something like that. But most of all, rather than the technical stuff, Tolkien is really concerned with describing Welsh as beautiful. So my chief point here is to emphasize the difference between the first learned language, the language of custom, and an individual's native language, his inherent linguistic predilections. Not to deny that he will share many of these with others of his community. He will share them, no doubt, in proportion as he shares other elements in his makeup. He then talks about this example of cellar door being a beautiful phrase. Well then, in Welsh for me, cellar doors are extraordinarily frequent, and moving to the higher dimension, the words in which there is pleasure in the contemplation of the association of form and sense are abundant. There's something very beautiful and rich and poetic about Welsh for Tolkien. And he carries on talking about other languages and how they compare to him and for him, his love of Gothic, his interest in Latin and Greek. And he sort of sums up by saying this: perhaps I might just say this, for it is not an analysis of Welsh or of myself I am attempting, but an assertion of a feeling of pleasure and of satisfaction as of a want fulfilled in the ordinary words for ordinary things that in Welsh I find so pleasing. He gives some examples. But this pleasure is felt most immediately and acutely in the moment of association. That is in the reception or imagination of a word form, which is felt to have a certain style, and the attribution to it of a meaning which is not received through it. So he's talking about the beauty of the language and how the sounds and the forms of language seem to enhance the meaning. Now, he gives lots of examples, and in the previous paragraphs, he talks about similar things in different languages, but Welsh, it seems to him, is a goldmine of these beautiful poetic associations. His knowledge of language is such that he could make these comparisons almost like a chef. Oh, this language has these elements and these benefits. This language has these. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of all these languages, and for him, Welsh was jammed full of what he called cellar doors, these beautiful, almost sonorous, musical means of expression. If I were pressed to give any example of this feature of this style, not only as an observable feature, but as a source of pleasure to myself, I should mention the fondness for nasal consonants, especially the much favoured N, and the frequency with which word patterns are made with soft and less sonorous W and voiced aspirants F and V, contrasted with the nasals. Now, he gives examples of words in Welsh. The only one I'm going to attempt here is Afon. And there's something about the contrast between the sounds in that he found particularly pleasing. And he says a very characteristic word is gogoniant. I hope I pronounced that right, which means glory. He was talking about almost the music of the language, the experience of the language on an aesthetic level, as well as then the meaning that it conveys. There's something beautiful about the forms and the consonants and the way it was put together. So, my pleasure in the Welsh linguistic style, though it may have an individual colouring, would not therefore be expected to be peculiar to myself among the English. It is not. It is present in many of them. It lies dormant, I believe, in many more of those who today live in Loegr and speak Saxony, so live in England and speak Saxon. For many of us, it rings a bell, or rather it stirs deep heartstrings in our linguistic nature. In other words, for satisfaction and therefore for delight. And very interestingly, he says, and not for imperial policy, we are still British at heart. It is the native language to which, in unexplored desire, we would still go home. So, to sum up this, his speech, this speech he gave to very, very, very learned linguists in Oxford in celebration of all things Celtic, even though as we see, he didn't particularly like the term Celtic. Spreading knowledge of the Welsh language is a missionary exercise for Tolkien. He talks of secret drinkers of Welsh at Oxford, like there's some almost occult or esoterical, almost countercultural element to learning Welsh, but he's on a mission to share that. He spoke of the rural suppression of the language by the tutors, and later the sort of false dichotomy between Teutonic and Celtic language and culture. The comparisons, the direct comparison he makes between Latin and Welsh and the archaic state of Welsh, as it arrived in England, speaks directly to the Brute and the Troy legend. There's no real other way of interpreting that. In his own way, fairly subtly, he was being very controversial. So there's then Welsh as the adminical, the sort of predecessor or the proof of the pudding of Old English, and that the Normans were the cause of the loss of much of this culture. I'll put not 1066, but 1277. Obviously, the Normans invaded in 1266. In 1277, Edward I made a concerted effort to undermine Bardic culture, the culture that sort of had woven the tapestry of British culture together. The bards were repurposed, let's say, from talking about wars and war leaders and Welsh culture into talking about love and chivalry. A lot of British storytelling happened as a result of the Norman conquest and their ongoing attempts to suppress British culture. He asserts Welsh is beautiful because of the relationships between sounds and meanings, and it plucks at the heartstrings of the English and gave resonance to both the content and the form of the Lord of the Rings. So some of the writing, some of the ways people speak in the Lord of the Rings, incredibly evocative. To me, it felt like speech from another age, from another era, and it's precisely because Tolkien was drawing on this knowledge of Welsh and its structures and forms that the language has such an incredible resonance and plucks at our heartstrings. This sentence he needed very near the end of his speech, I think, demonstrates the structure which he used to such incredible resonant effect, and why his writing is so much better than so many other people who wrote in the fantasy genre. He was embedding the language, embedding the way people express themselves in a grammar that predates English and gives it that resonance. So it is to the native tongue to which in the unexplored desire we would still go home. There's something wonderful about the structure of that sentence to me. So he was very much a poet, writing stories of good and evil, trying to rekindle this sense of the epic in the English now. So this is a depiction of Helm's Deep as represented in shown in the Lord of the Rings film. In the Two Towers, the Rohirrim go here as their final redoubt. This is the place they've built in case their land had been invaded. Now, this is obviously a fictional place, but for me, there was a video I watched by Ross that suddenly made this fictional idea much more concrete and historical. And I have to say, when I watched both parts of this video, especially part 2, it made the hairs on my arm stand up. Ross is depicting here a place called Rhys Ison. It shows you around in the video this place called Rhys Ison, which was built deliberately as a redoubt for defense of the territory. It's an absolutely massive site, must have taken several generations to build, hundreds of thousands of tons of earth, hundreds of thousands of tons of, or tens of thousands of tons of stone, all built on this natural hilltop to create a place very, very much like Helm's Deep. the final, I'm going to say redoubt, the final hiding place of designed and built so you could hide there if your country was being invaded, if South Wales, if Glamorgan had been invaded. This video for me, when I watched it, especially part 2, it blew my mind, because I suddenly saw that what Tolkien was speaking to, was describing, was intimating in The Lord of the Rings, was really there in our landscape if we had the eyes to see it. And I'll forever be in Ross's debt for showing me this and for helping me understand myself as a Brit. I am British, I'm not English. English is a misnomer, is almost a colonial term. 90-odd% of us in this country are British. And this is our culture, this is our history. And this is why, for me, Tolkien resonated so deeply with me. He was using sentence structure, he was using themes that spoke to my pre-Norman culture, my pre-Norman legacy, my pre-Norman culture. And this, for me, is just one way in which the Britain's Hidden History project has just been a massive benefit to me and my understanding of myself and my culture, and, you know, England as an imperial force. Britain, as such, the British were not. The Welsh, the British, they lived on this island. The English, let's say the Normans, came here and turned it into the heart of an empire. And it's this distinction that I make now between British culture, which is much more egalitarian, and let's say English culture, which is much more hierarchical, kings, queens, dukes, lords and ladies. And I hope by sharing this, or showing you this, what Tolkien wrote about the Welsh, you could see that had he been around today, he'd have been a massive advocate for the Britain's Hidden History project, because it spoke to all the things that he cared about, the loss of this culture, the loss of this richness in our lives as a result of the Norman conquest, which he and his friends were very angry about over 1,000 years later. So for me, this is made this in tribute to the work Ross has done and the influence and the continued influence it has on me and hopefully on other people. Tolkien, as we all know, one of the most influential people in 20th century culture in the West. And for Tolkien, that was all about communicating this Welsh, this British culture that had been decimated by the Norman conquest. So you can see that Tolkien would have been very much a member, at least in his heart, of the Britain's Hidden History group. And I hope we can all take inspiration and solace from that, as I continue to take inspiration and solace from the memory of Ross Broadstock. Yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you again, Tim, for helping me make this.